Today on the Perception in Action podcast, a look at the somewhat controversial topic of general perceptual motor abilities. Are there general abilities such as agility and hand-eye coordination that apply to all sports? Or are the abilities underlying effective performance primarily sport-specific? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to look at the interesting and often hotly debated topic of general perceptual motor abilities. A general perceptual motor ability was defined by Richard Schmidt in 1991 as, quote, an inherited, relatively enduring, stable trait of an individual that underlies or supports various kinds of motor and cognitive activities or skills, unquote. Commonly cited examples include eye-hand coordination, agility, reaction time, and balance. If we look specifically at eye-hand coordination, the idea here is that there exists a general ability of using visual information to guide the movements of one's limbs that should support a broad range of different sporting tasks. For example, all those involving interception. So a person with quote-unquote good eye-hand coordination should be better at catching, playing tennis, hitting a baseball, etc., as compared to someone with poor eye-hand coordination. A general perceptual motor ability is non-sport specific, so it supports a broad range of different related tasks. For me, there are actually three important questions related to this topic. Question number 1. Do general perceptual motor abilities exist? I will dive into the specifics of how this is tested in a moment, but the basic thing we're asking here is there a relationship between the performance on tasks that would seem to involve the same general skill? Question number 2. Should we be testing the general perceptual motor abilities as a way of screening and evaluating athletes? For example, is using a device like Dynavision, which is a non-sport-specific general test of eye-hand coordination, an effective way to predict which young athlete will be better at tennis, and/or an effective way to evaluate the improvement of a tennis player in training? And finally, question number 3. Should we attempt to improve the general perceptual motor abilities of athletes through training? For example, should we have a tennis player we are working with practice on Dynavision every week so their quote-unquote eye-hand coordination continues to improve? Will that make them a better tennis player? For me, these last two questions are particularly important to consider at this point in time, because, as most regular listeners of the podcast well know, devices which assess and train general perceptual motor abilities for sports is a continually growing market. Just again focusing on eye-hand coordination, I mentioned Dynavision, but more recent examples include NeuroTracker, the Batak Pro, the Nike Spark Sensory Station, FitLight, and Synaptech Sensory Station, just to name a few. To go with these high-tech systems, there's also things like the Salmon's graded pegboard and the wall catch test. Does there exist a general ability that would allow an athlete to perform well on all of these tests? Is it worth the money, time, and effort to use them as an evaluation or training tool? Let's dive in. Before I get started, I want to note that my goal here is not to give a comprehensive review of all the work that has been done on this topic. The idea that there might exist general perceptual motor abilities can be traced back to the 1940s and 50s with the work of researchers like Thurstone, Sperman, and Fleischmann. And it continues to be a very popular topic, so there's a lot of research out there. What I want to do in this episode is briefly review some of the previous work in this area and then focus on a couple more recent studies. Work in this area really began in earnest with the advent of factor analysis. For those that don't know, factor analysis is a data analysis method that allows us to take a large data set, for example scores on a large set of perceptual motor tests, and determine how the results cluster together into factors, which you later attempt to give some conceptual meaning to. Imagine, for example, that I took a large number of athletes and gave them the following tests: Snellen eye chart, depth perception test, dynamic visual acuity test, squat max, leg lift max, hamstring curl max. If we performed a factor analysis, the results from these tests would most likely group into two clusters or factors. That is, participants that did well on the eye chart test might also tend to do well on the depth perception and dynamic acuity tests, while those that did well on the squats would also likely do well on the leg and curl tests. Seeing these two factors, we would label them something like vision and leg strength. Using this approach, Fleischmann identified 11 psychomotor abilities, including multi-limb coordination and movement precision, and 9 physical abilities, including static and dynamic strength and flexibility. So with these kind of proposed general abilities identified, how do we go about answering question number 1? Do they really exist and support performance or not? This has really been done in 2 different ways. One involves identifying a sport in which you think a particular general motor ability is particularly important. For example, if it exists, eye-hand coordination is certainly something we would expect to be important in baseball. Next, we compare athletes of different skill levels within that sport. If general abilities do exist, then we expect higher level athletes, say professionals, to score better on eye-hand coordination tests as compared to lower level ones, say minor leaguers. I will get to studies that have used this approach in a second, but I want to first focus on the primary method that has been used to address this issue, measuring the correlations between different tests of the same general ability. The idea here is that if a general perceptual motor ability like eye-hand coordination does exist, then if we use a set of tests that all measure eye-hand coordination in different ways, there should be some positive relationship between the scores on these tests. So for example, a participant that performs well on catching a ball bounced off a wall should also perform well on turning lights off on a Dynavision board and following a moving target with a stylus on a screen, because good quote-unquote eye-hand coordination would allow for good performance on all of these tests. What has been found using this approach? Generally very low correlation values between tests. For example, in one of the very early studies in this area, in 1930, Seashore tested 50 people on 8 different fine motor skills and found average correlation values between tests of 0.25. I will consider what that value means in a second, but as a more recent example, consider the study published in 2018 by Ellison and colleagues. In this study, 87 participants across a range of sports were evaluated on 4 different tests of eye-hand coordination. 1, the sports vision trainer, which similar to Dynavision and FitLight involves turning off lights by hitting them with your hand. 2, the Batak, which has a different layout and stimuli, but again requires you to hit lights that turn on. The main difference between these 2 tests is that the SVT presents targets in more central vision on a table, while the Batak is more peripheral, with lights presented on a rack you stand in front of. The 3rd test was the Salmon's graded pegboard, which requires participants to pick up pegs from a table and put them into appropriate holes as fast as possible. And finally, the wall catch test was used. This requires a participant to throw a ball underhand off the wall with one hand and catch it with the other, repeatedly, and alternating between hands, with the score being the total number of successful catches. So on the surface, all of these tests do seem to involve similar task demands. Specifically, the ability to coordinate the movement of your hand as quickly and accurately as possible to some location based on the visual information you pick up. So, they should be related, right? What was found? Of the possible 6 correlations, only 2 were found to be of moderate strength or greater. The correlation between the scores on the Batak and Sport Vision Trainer, which remember both involve turning off lights with your hand, was 0.54. While the correlation between the Batak and the wall catch task was 0.35. So what does this mean? Well, I think it depends on what side of the fence you sit on in this argument. If you are a proponent of the idea that general perceptual motor abilities do exist, the fact that we do find some statistically significant positive correlations suggests that there is something in common that supports the performance on both of these tasks. But if you're a bit more of a skeptic of this idea, which full disclosure I will admit I am, then you might argue that the results, although significant, aren't really that impressive, and maybe too small to have any real practical value. Let's look at the Ellison et al. Results a bit more closely to consider this point. Recall that there was a correlation between the Batak and the Sport Vision Trainer of 0.54, and the Batak and the wall catch task of 0.35. Another way to think about correlations is in terms of explained variance. You get this by squaring the correlation value to get another value called R squared. So let's look at the BATAC and Sport Vision Trainer. When you measure performance on these tests in a group of athletes, the scores will vary. There will be variance. What we want to do as researchers and testers is try to explain why this variance occurred. Do scores vary because of age, gender, playing experience, or in this case, some general ability like eye-hand coordination? R-squared values tell you the percentage of variance that you have successfully explained using some variable like one of these. So in the case of the BATAC and Sport Vision Trainer, a correlation of 0.54 gives an R-squared value of 0.29, or 29%. This means that 29% of the variance in scores can be explained by some common factor, like eye-hand coordination, while 71% of the variance is due to other factors. This may not sound like much, but it's actually pretty good for what is typically found in psychology research. But remember how similar these two tasks were. Both involve turning off lights with your hand. Let's move to a slightly different task, the wall catch. Now the correlation with the BATAC and this one is 0.35, giving an R-squared value of 0.12 or 12%, which means that we now have 88% of the variance in scores unexplained. Getting a little bit less convincing, right? And this is the point I want to make in terms of the practical value of general motor abilities. As we move from two tests that are essentially the same, to one test and a test that's a very simple motor task that involves bouncing the ball off the wall with one hand, the explained variance goes down from 29 to 12%. How much more is it going to go down when we compare the BATAC to a real complex sports skill like hitting a baseball or a cricket ball? It is clear that whatever general ability that supports both an artificial non-sport specific lab test like the BATAC and a real-world sports skill like batting is likely to be very, very small indeed. Why does the percentage of variance explained keep getting smaller and smaller when the tests of the same quote-unquote general ability like eye-hand coordination begin to have more and more differences? As Ellison and colleagues nicely discuss in their article, it's because when we do a task analysis of different tasks labeled to involve eye-hand coordination, we see that eye-hand coordination involves the complex integration of a number of distinct functions, including visual detection of the target, focusing attention on a target, perceptual identification, planning and programming the initial interceptive movement, online control or steering of the limb towards the target, and execution of the grasping, striking movement itself. And of course, the ability to use outcome feedback to make adjustments. Consider the difference between the BATAC or Dynavision and hitting a pitched baseball. The perceptual information is completely different. One involves detection of the onset of a static target. The other involves tracking a movement target and picking up information about time to collision and direction. One is completely unpredictable. In the other, the performer can use situational probabilities and advanced cues. One involves primarily an arm movement, the other requires full body coordination to effectively transfer force, and so on. All of these differences between tasks matter. Any or all of them is going to result in the amount of variance explained between the two going down and down, such that the only way we'll be able to find something in common between them is when we either simplify the real task a lot or we look at athletes performing at a very low level. So yes, general perceptual motor abilities might exist, but I would argue they only have meaning for very similar tasks, which is not going to be the case for most of the things we care about in sport. This view has been shared by the most prominent researcher in this field, Franklin Henry, who took the lack of strong correlations and proposed the theory of specific motor abilities, which argues that successful performance is reliant on a discrete cluster of abilities specific to the particular perceptual motor task being considered. Performance on any motor skill is based upon a very large number of independent abilities that are used in a highly context-specific way, with each skill drawing upon an almost unique combination of abilities. Thus, the contribution of any one general ability is likely to be incredibly small. Okay, let's turn to the other two questions I laid out at the start of this episode. First, is it worth testing for general perceptual motor abilities? I talked about a couple examples of testing for general perceptual abilities in baseball back in episode 83. For example, in a study published in 2017, Clemish and colleagues measured visual abilities of hitters and pitchers using the Nike Sensory Station. Despite some issues with type 1 error and face validity, which I discussed, they did find that these two groups differed on a couple variables: contrast sensitivity and stereo acuity. As predicted, hitters, for whom good vision is presumably more important, did better than pitchers. Another similar example is the well-known study from Lanegan and colleagues from 1996, showing that baseball players have better visual acuity than the normal population of non-players. What do these results demonstrate? Well, first, some have argued that the fact that we do find skill level differences on general, non-specific tasks like these provides evidence for general perceptual motor abilities, i.e., good vision is required for hitting. But as Ellison and colleagues point out in their article, comparisons of athletes at different skill levels provide only weak evidence. For example, if a professional baseball player does better on a battery of vision tests compared to a non-playing population, it could be due to a general ability like good vision, but it could also be due to the fact they're more motivated, can focus their attention better, don't get as mentally fatigued, etc. There are a host of factors that could explain the differences. Turning to the more important practical question, should we bother testing for non-sport specific general abilities in athletes? For me, the bulk of evidence related to this question is consistent with the points I was trying to make when looking at correlations between tests. That is, the amount of variance explained is only meaningful when the things we are measuring are highly similar. The corollary of this is that when testing, we should only find significant differences on test scores when the groups we are evaluating are highly different. And this is exactly what we see. Major leaguers versus non-athletes, hitters versus pitchers is where we see the effects. To date, there's very little evidence that we can use such tests to reliably discriminate between performers at a similar level. The classic example for me is the study I discussed back in episode 110, showing essentially no relationship between scores used in the NFL Combine and NFL statistics. Because general motor abilities, which several of the Combine tests measure, only explain a significant amount of variance for similar tasks and can only discriminate between athletes at very different levels, they have almost no value when relating to the complex skill of playing football and measuring athletes at a similar level, college players being drafted into the NFL. As I've mentioned a few times previously, for me the only value of generalized non-sport specific testing in sport is the identification of abnormalities or deficits. That's where an athlete is subnormal and may require some visual correction or another type of additional training. This is somewhat consistent with a recent hierarchical model of sports vision proposed by Daniel Levy, where basic general visual functions like acuity and contrast sensitivity form the foundation for developing sport-specific visual skills like using the advanced cues from a pitcher's delivery. If you don't have the building blocks of normal general ability, for example, the image of the pitcher is completely blurry to you, it will be less likely you will develop the sport-specific abilities. But beyond this, I personally don't see there's any value in screening or evaluating athletes that have normal abilities or above and are already at a high level. But I remain to be proven wrong, and I will continue to look at research on this topic. Turning to the final question, it should be pretty obvious what I'm going to argue here. Is it worth training general perceptual motor skills like eye-hand coordination, stereo acuity, reaction time, agility, etc. to improve the on-field performance of athletes? Heck no. If, as I've been arguing, these abilities contribute only a very, very small amount to most complex real-world sports skills, then it doesn't seem to be an efficient use of time to try and improve them if there's no deficit present. Yes, someone might argue that 1% gains are the key to sports success, but I will personally spend my time waiting in the nice big 99% sports-specific pool, thank you very much. As I've discussed several times on the podcast now, although general perceptual motor training has been around for over 40 years, there's no convincing evidence, using sound experimental methods, that it has any real impact on sports performance. The most rigorous study in this field is by Abernathy and Wood from 2001, which I discussed in the very first episode of this podcast. It found absolutely no benefits of the training. Despite being around for over 25 years, there's no clear evidence of any benefits for dynavision, as I discussed in episode 12D. And more broadly, recent analyses have shown there's no significant effect of generalized brain training, for example, playing games to improve working memory, attentional focus, etc. Again, I would make the evidence-based argument that it's a much more efficient use of training time to focus on sport-specific perceptual motor abilities, like using advanced cues for anticipation and developing effective gaze strategies, than it is to attempt to improve general abilities. Before wrapping up today's episode, I wanted to mention a recent paper by Hans, McIntyre, and Parker, which attempts to situate the concept of general perceptual motor abilities within Newell's constraint theory. In this proposed model, a general perceptual motor ability is a unidimensional construct, which one might consider to be the ability to learn motor skills by adapting to the individual, task, and environmental constraints. This ability changes and adapts in response to the interaction of personal, developmental, and environmental influences. It therefore is not a fixed inherited capacity, but a capability that both increases and declines across time. It is proposed that it is predominantly influenced by biological foundations in infancy and increasingly influenced by environmental factors with age, and then reverses with the biological decline associated with old age. While on the one hand, this idea is consistent with the feedback I get from a lot of coaches, that there are some athletes that are simply better adapters and self-organizers than others. However, I think this model might be a bit too broad to have much value. For example, I'm not sure how we would go about measuring the general ability of adapting to constraints, since by definition it's context specific. But anyways, I will leave it to you to make your own decision. Link in the show notes. So, to sum up, although I'm willing to concede general perceptual motor abilities like eye-hand coordination and agility do exist in some form, for me they lose their practical value very, very quickly once we begin to use more complex sporting tasks and consider athletes at higher levels. Using tests for general abilities for identifying deficits at lower level sports could have some value for guiding the design of individual training programs. But beyond that, I personally do not see the value of testing and training for general abilities. We should be using our energy in developing tests and training methods that adhere to the principles of representative learning design instead. For further discussion of this issue and alternative ways of thinking about these ideas, please listen back to episode 110, where I talk about the concept of donor sports. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out PerceptionAction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials including an extra monthly episode and written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/PerceptionAction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.